in 634 AD, King Oswald and 700 Northumbrians faced 1,000 Welsh invaders led by Cadwallon near Hadrian's Wall. This battle, where our good knight stood, determined England's religious future. Oswald's wooden cross, prayer and tactical brilliance led to a miraculous victory. The Northumbrians channeled the enemy into a killing ground, and a vision of St. Columba inspired them. Splinters of Oswald's cross gained healing powers, and Cadwallon was killed 10 miles away at Devil's Water. This epic battle shaped Christian England. Subscribe to the Good Knight stories for immersive historical journeys and comment on future battles. In the meantime, settle in for the story of 700 men who changed a kingdom's fate. The Battle of Heavenfield, A Divine Reckoning, A Good Knight Story, Chapter 1. The Broken Kingdom. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Hadrian's Wall like the breath of ghosts, and our silver-armored good knight stood among the ruins of what had once been the edge of the Roman world, watching as a young king prepared to reclaim his birthright or die in the attempt. The year was 634 AD, and Northumbria, that great kingdom which stretched from the Humber to the Forth, lay broken, its people scattered like leaves before the storm of war. The good knight had walked these lands for centuries, had seen the Romans march north with their eagles gleaming, had watched the Picts paint themselves blue for battle, had witnessed the first Saxon longships grinding against British shores. But never had he seen a kingdom so thoroughly shattered as Northumbria had become in this dark year of our Lord. It had begun the previous autumn at a place called Hatfield Chase, where King Edwin of Northumbria, that great Christian king who had ruled with wisdom and strength, had fallen beneath the swords of an unlikely alliance. Cadwallon ap Cadfan, the Welsh king of Gwynedd, had joined forces with Penda of Mercia, that fierce pagan lord, and together they had brought down the mightiest kingdom in Britain. Edwin's death had been more than the fall of a king. It had been the collapse of an entire world. The good knight remembered that terrible day, remembered the screams of dying horses and the clash of iron on iron, remembered how Edwin's golden banner had fallen into the mud, and how the ravens had come in their thousands to feast. But what followed had been worse than any single battle. Cadwallon had not been content with victory. He had sought to erase the very memory of Northumbrian power. For a full year, Cadwallon's forces had swept across the land like a plague of locusts. The venerable Bede, that learned monk who would one day chronicle these dark times, would write that Cadwallon was more savage than any pagan, a man who sought not to rule, but to destroy, not to conquer, but to exterminate. Villages burned, monasteries were sacked. The great halls where warriors had once gathered to hear the songs of their ancestors fell silent, their timbers blackened by flame. The good knight had seen such devastation before, had watched Rome burn, had witnessed the sack of great cities. But there was something particularly cruel about Cadwallon's campaign. This was not the clean violence of conquest, but the methodical brutality of annihilation. Women and children were not spared. Holy places were defiled. The very stones seemed to weep. Edwin's death had fractured Northumbria back into its ancient divisions. Deira, the southern kingdom, had fallen to Osric, Edwin's cousin, a man who had abandoned his Christian faith in his desperation to hold power. Bernicia, the northern realm, had been claimed by Eanfrith, brother to the man who now stood before the good knight in the morning mist. Both had died within months. Osric had been the first to fall, killed while attempting to besiege Cadwallon in some forgotten fortress. The good knight had not been there to witness his end, but he had heard the stories, how Osric had charged the walls with too few men and too little faith, how his body had been left to rot in the summer sun while Cadwallon's warriors jeered from the battlements. Eanfrith's death had been even more foolish. The man had actually sought to negotiate with Cadwallon, had ridden to the Welsh king's camp with only 12 companions, believing that words might succeed where swords had failed. Cadwallon had received him with smiles and wine, had listened to his proposals for peace, and then had ordered him butchered like a sheep. His head had been sent back to Bamborough as Cadwallon's answer to any talk of surrender. Bede would later call that year unhappy and hateful to all good men, and the good knight understood why. It had been a time when the very foundations of the world seemed to crack, when the old certainties crumbled like ancient mortar. The Christian kingdom that Edwin had built lay in ruins. The pagan gods seemed to laugh from their dark groves, and in the midst of it all, Cadwallon ruled like some demon king from the old stories, delighting in destruction for its own sake. But now, as the mist began to lift from the wall, the good knight watched a new player enter this deadly game. Oswald, son of Aethelfrith, brother to the murdered Eanfrith, had returned from 17 years of exile to claim what was his by right. He was young, barely 30, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of steel beneath the silk, of fire beneath the calm exterior. The good knight studied this young king as he moved among his men. Oswald was not tall, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of one born to command. His hair was the colour of autumn wheat, his eyes the grey of winter seas. He wore no crown. Such things were for peacetime. But every man in that small army looked to him as if he were already king of all the world, and small it was, this army that had come to reclaim a kingdom. The good knight counted perhaps 700 men, many of them young, most of them bearing weapons that had seen better days. They were a mixture of Bernician nobles who had fled into exile with their prince, Irish warriors from Dalriada who had sworn themselves to Oswald's service, and a handful of Northumbrian thanes who had slipped away from Cadwallon's rule to join their rightful lord. 700 men to face the conqueror of Northumbria. The good knight had seen such odds before. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans had held the pass against the might of Persia. At Alesia, Caesar had been outnumbered 10 to 1, but those had been different times, different men. These were Anglo-Saxons and Celts, warriors who fought with spear and sword and shield, men whose grandfathers had worshipped Thor and Woden, whose great-grandfathers had painted themselves with woad and charged Roman legions naked but for their courage. Yet there was something different about this army, something the good knight had not seen in the pagan hosts of old. These men knelt in prayer before they sharpened their swords. They crossed themselves before they donned their mail. They sang hymns as they marched, their voices rising like incense in the morning air. Oswald had spent his exile in the monastery of Iona, that holy island where Saint Columba had brought the light of Christ to the Scots and Picts. For 17 years he had lived among the monks, learning not just the arts of war but the deeper mysteries of faith. He had returned not just as a king, but as a Christian king, and his army reflected that transformation. The good knight watched as Oswald moved through the ranks, speaking quietly to his captains, checking weapons and armor, offering words of encouragement to the younger warriors. There was no bluster about him, no empty boasting. He spoke of duty and honor, of the need to restore justice to a land that had known only terror. But beneath his calm words, the good knight could sense the steel of absolute determination. We are few. Oswald said to his assembled thanes as the sun climbed higher in the sky. "But we are not alone. The God of our fathers marches with us. The saints of Ireland and Scotland pray for us, and the very stones of this ancient wall cry out for justice." The good knight looked around at the faces of the men who listened to their king's words. Some were grey-bearded veterans who remembered the great days of Aethelfrith, Oswald's father. Others were barely old enough to grow whiskers, young men who had known nothing but Cadwalladen's tyranny. But all of them shared the same expression, a mixture of fear and hope, of desperation and determination. They knew the odds. They knew that somewhere to the south, Cadwallon was marching north with an army that outnumbered them. They knew that by nightfall, many of them would be dead. But they also knew that they were fighting for more than just a kingdom. They were fighting for their faith, their families, their very identity as a people. The good knight had seen such moments before, had stood with men who faced impossible odds for causes greater than themselves. There was always a moment, sometimes just a heartbeat, sometimes an hour, when everything hung in the balance, when the future of nations could be decided by the courage or cowardice of a few hundred souls. As the morning wore on, scouts began to return with news of Cadwallon's approach. The Welsh king was coming, they reported, and he was coming in strength. 1,000 men or more, they said, warriors from Gwynedd and Powys, mercenaries from Ireland, even some Northumbrian turncoats who had thrown in their lot with the conqueror. The good knight watched Oswald receive these reports with the same calm demeanour he had shown all morning. The young king asked practical questions. How far away was the enemy? What route were they taking? What was the condition of their horses? But showed no sign of fear or doubt. It was as if he had already seen the outcome of the coming battle, as if some inner voice had whispered to him the secrets of fate. And perhaps it had. For as the sun reached its zenith and the time for battle drew near, Oswald would do something that would echo through the centuries, something that would transform a desperate military gamble into a moment of divine revelation. The good knight did not yet know what was coming, but he could feel it in the air like the charge before a thunderstorm, could sense that this day would be different from all the days that had come before. The broken kingdom was about to be reborn, and our silver-armored knight would witness every moment of its resurrection. Chapter 2. The Vision of St. Columba. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the moorland, as Oswald's small army made its final preparations for battle, and the good knight watched with growing fascination as the young king began to display the deep spiritual conviction that would define not just this day, but the very nature of Christian kingship in Britain. There was something building in the air around Oswald, something that went beyond mere military preparation, a sense of divine purpose that seemed to emanate from the man like heat from a forge. The good knight had witnessed many commanders on the eve of battle. He had seen Caesar pace before his tent at Alessia, had watched Harold Godwinson pray at Hastings, had stood with countless kings and generals as they faced their moment of destiny. But there was something different about Oswald. Something that spoke of a man who had moved beyond the realm of mere human ambition into something far more profound. As the day wore on, messengers continued to arrive with reports of Cadwallon's advance. The Welsh king was perhaps 10 miles to the south, moving steadily northward with his great host. His banners could be seen from the hilltops, the red dragon of Gwynedd, the boar of Powys, and others that the scouts could not identify. The very earth seemed to tremble beneath the feet of his army. But if Oswald felt any fear at these reports, he did not show it. Instead, he spent the afternoon in quiet consultation with his captains, studying the ground where they would make their stand, examining every stone and slope that might give them advantage. The good knight followed at a respectful distance, listening as the young king discussed tactics with the calm precision of a master craftsman. "We will position ourselves here," Oswald said, pointing to a stretch of ground between Brady's Crag and the ancient Roman wall. "The enemy will be forced to come at us through this narrow gap. They cannot outflank us, cannot bring their superior numbers to bear all at once." His captains nodded, understanding immediately the wisdom of the position. It was the same strategy that had served defenders throughout history. Use the terrain to negate the enemy's advantages. Force them to fight on your terms rather than their own. But the GoodKnight could see that Oswald's thinking went deeper than mere tactics. There was something almost mystical about the way he spoke of the coming battle, as if he saw patterns and possibilities that were hidden from other men. As evening approached and the time for rest drew near, Oswald withdrew to a small rise overlooking the battlefield. The GoodKnight watched from a distance as the young king knelt in prayer, his lips moving silently as he communed with his God. The sight was not unusual. Many Christian warriors prayed before battle, but there was an intensity to Oswald's devotion that set him apart from other men. The night was clear and cold, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The GoodKnight found himself a position where he could observe both Oswald and the sleeping army, settling in for what he expected would be a long and restless night. Around him, the Northumbrian warriors tried to find what rest they could, huddled around small fires that cast dancing shadows on the ancient stones of the wall. But sleep would not come easily this night, for all of them knew that dawn would bring either victory or death. The GoodKnight could hear the quiet murmur of prayers, the soft scrape of whetstones on steel, the occasional nervous laugh of young men trying to mask their fear. It was the sound of an army preparing not just for battle, but for judgment. Oswald remained apart from his men, still kneeling in prayer on his small hill. The GoodKnight watched him with growing curiosity, wondering what thoughts occupied the mind of this young king who had returned from exile to face such impossible odds. What did a man pray for in such circumstances? Victory? Courage? The strength to die well? As the night deepened and the fires burned lower, something extraordinary began to happen. The GoodKnight, with his supernatural senses honed by centuries of existence, felt it first. A change in the very air around Oswald, a subtle shift in the fabric of reality itself. The temperature seemed to drop, though no wind stirred. The stars appeared to brighten, though no clouds had passed. And there was a presence, something that made the hair on the back of the GoodKnight's neck stand on end. Oswald's prayers had taken on a different quality. His voice, though still barely audible, carried a note of wonder, of recognition. The GoodKnight crept closer, drawn by an instinct he could not name, and what he saw would remain etched in his memory for all the centuries to come. A figure was materializing beside the kneeling king, not solid like a living man, but translucent, shimmering like moonlight on water. The GoodKnight had seen many strange things in his long existence, had witnessed miracles and horrors that would drive lesser men mad. But this was something different. This was not the dark magic of pagan sorcerers or the illusions of desperate men. This was something holy, something that seemed to sanctify the very ground on which it appeared. The figure was that of an elderly monk, tall and dignified, with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. He wore the simple brown robes of the Irish monasteries, and around his head was a nimbus of soft light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. The GoodKnight knew immediately who this must be: Saint Columba, the great missionary who had brought Christianity to the Scots and Picts, the holy man who had founded the monastery of Iona, where Oswald had spent his years of exile. But Columba had been dead for more than 30 years. What stood before Oswald now was something beyond the realm of mortal flesh, a spirit sent from the very throne of God to deliver a message to his chosen servant. The saint's voice, when he spoke, was like the whisper of wind through ancient trees, barely audible yet somehow carrying clearly to the good knight's supernatural hearing. "Fear not, my son," Columba said, his ghostly hand resting on Oswald's shoulder. "Tomorrow you shall go forth to battle, and the Lord shall deliver your enemies into your hands. Victory is assured, for you fight not for earthly glory, but for the glory of God." Oswald's response was barely a whisper, but the good knight caught every word. "Father, I am but one man with a handful of warriors. How can we stand against such a host?" The saint's smile was radiant, transforming his ethereal features with divine joy. Did not David slay Goliath with but a stone? Did not Gideon defeat the Midianites with 300 men? The Lord delights in showing his power through the weak, that none may boast save in him alone. Trust in his providence, my son, and you shall see wonders. The vision continued for what seemed like hours, though the good knight knew that time itself seemed to bend and flow differently in the presence of the divine. Columba spoke of many things, of the destiny that awaited Oswald, of the kingdom he would build, of the faith he would spread throughout the land. He spoke of Lindisfarne, that holy island where Aidan would one day establish a monastery that would become a beacon of learning and piety. He spoke of the golden age that would come to Northumbria under Oswald's rule, when art and scholarship would flourish as never before. But he also spoke of sacrifice, of the price that must be paid for such glory. "Your reign will be brief but brilliant," the saint warned, his voice taking on a note of sadness. "Like a candle that burns twice as bright, you will illuminate the darkness for a time, and then you will be called home to your reward. But fear not this fate, for your death will serve God's purposes as surely as your life." The good knight felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had seen enough of history to know that the greatest kings often burned brightest and died youngest, that those chosen by God for special purposes were often called to make the ultimate sacrifice. But there was something beautiful in the saint's words as well, a promise that Oswald's brief reign would echo through the centuries, inspiring future generations to seek the same combination of earthly wisdom and heavenly grace. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the vision began to fade. St. Columba's form grew ever more translucent, his voice ever softer, until finally he was gone like morning mist before the sun. But his final words lingered in the air like an echo. "Raise the sign of Christ before your army, my son, and let all men know in whose name you fight. The cross shall be your banner, and in that sign you shall conquer." Oswald remained kneeling for a long time after the saint had vanished, his face transformed by an inner light that seemed to rival the growing dawn. When he finally rose, it was with the bearing of a man who had looked upon eternity and found his place within it. The doubt and uncertainty that might have plagued a lesser man were gone, replaced by an absolute certainty that he was an instrument of divine will. The good knight watched in fascination as Oswald strode down from his hill of prayer, his movements filled with new purpose and energy. The young king's face was radiant with joy and determination, and when he spoke to his awakening warriors, his voice carried a note of absolute conviction that sent shivers down the spine of every man who heard it. "My brothers!" Oswald called out, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "I have received a vision from the blessed Saint Columba, who has promised us victory in the name of Christ our Lord. Today we fight not just for Northumbria, but for the very soul of this land. Today we show the world that the God of the Christians is mightier than all the pagan gods combined." The effect on the army was immediate and profound. Men who had been nervous and uncertain the night before now stood straighter, their eyes bright with newfound hope. The good knight could see the transformation spreading through the ranks like wildfire, doubt giving way to faith, fear yielding to courage, despair replaced by an almost mystical confidence in their cause. But Oswald was not finished. As his men gathered around him in the growing light of dawn, he began to speak of something that would transform this battle from a mere military engagement into a moment of profound spiritual significance. "Before we take our positions," he announced, "we shall raise a sign that will proclaim to all the world the source of our strength. We shall erect a cross upon this field, and before it we shall kneel and pray for victory." The good knight felt his ancient heart quicken at these words. He had seen many battles, had witnessed countless acts of courage and faith, but never had he heard of such a thing. To raise a cross before a battle, to make such a public declaration of Christian faith in an age when paganism still held sway over much of the land, it was an act of either supreme confidence or supreme folly. As the sun climbed higher and the time for battle drew near, Oswald's men set about their sacred task. They found a suitable piece of timber. Some said it came from a nearby copse, others claimed it had been part of an old Roman structure, and began to fashion it into the shape of a cross. The work was done with reverent care, each man who touched the wood understanding that he was participating in something far greater than mere carpentry. The good knight watched as the cross took shape, marveling at the skill and devotion of the men who crafted it. This was no crude assemblage of sticks, but a carefully constructed symbol that would stand as a testament to their faith for generations to come. When it was finished, it stood nearly twice the height of a man, its arms spread wide as if to embrace the entire world. The moment had come to raise it, and Oswald himself took hold of the base, his captains and thanes gathering around to help lift the sacred burden. The good knight found himself moving closer, drawn by an irresistible compulsion to witness this historic moment. As the cross rose into the morning air, he felt something shift in the very fabric of reality, as if the boundary between heaven and earth had grown thin. When the cross stood upright, firmly planted in the soil of Northumbria, Oswald did something that would be remembered and celebrated for centuries to come. He knelt before it, and his entire army followed suit. 700 warriors, from the greatest thane to the humblest spearman, went down on their knees before the symbol of their faith. The prayer that followed was unlike anything the good knight had ever heard. It was not the formal Latin of the Roman Church, nor the elaborate Celtic liturgies of the Irish monasteries, but something simpler and more profound, the heartfelt plea of men who knew they faced death and sought the blessing of the Almighty. Oswald's voice led them, but soon every man was praying in his own words, in his own tongue, creating a chorus of supplication that seemed to rise like incense to the very throne of God. "Lord God of hosts," Oswald prayed, his voice carrying clearly across the kneeling ranks. "We are few, and our enemies are many. But we trust not in the strength of our arms or the sharpness of our swords, but in your mighty power. Grant us victory this day, not for our own glory, but for the glory of your holy name. Let this cross be a sign to all the world that you are the one true God, and that those who trust in you shall never be put to shame." The good knight felt tears streaming down his face, tears he had not shed in centuries of existence. There was something so pure, so beautiful about this moment, that it seemed to wash away the accumulated cynicism of ages. These were not perfect men. He could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt that lingered despite their faith. But they were men who had chosen to trust in something greater than themselves, men who were willing to die for a cause they believed to be just and holy. As the prayer ended and the warriors began to rise, the good knight noticed something remarkable. The cross, which had been fashioned from ordinary timber just hours before, seemed to glow with an inner light. It was subtle. Perhaps only he, with his supernatural perception, could see it clearly. But it was unmistakably there, a sign that heaven itself had blessed this humble symbol. Word of the cross spread quickly through the ranks, and with it came stories of miracles. Some claimed they had seen angels hovering above it during the prayer. Others swore they had heard the voices of saints joining in their supplication. Whether these things were real or merely the product of heightened emotions and desperate hope, the GoodKnight could not say. But he could see the effect they had on the army. Doubt was banished, fear was conquered, and in their place rose a confidence that bordered on the supernatural. As the morning wore on and the time for battle approached, the cross became the focal point of the entire army. Men would approach it to touch its base, to whisper private prayers, to draw strength from its presence. The GoodKnight watched as hardened warriors wept openly before it, as young men found courage they never knew they possessed, as the entire character of the army was transformed by this simple wooden symbol. But the cross was more than just a rallying point for the troops. It was a declaration, a challenge thrown down before the forces of paganism and chaos. It proclaimed to all the world that this was a Christian army fighting a holy war, that they served not earthly masters but the King of Kings himself. And as reports came in of Cadwalladen's approach, the GoodKnight knew that the Welsh king would understand the significance of what he saw. The stage was set for more than just a battle between two armies. This would be a clash between two worldviews, two ways of understanding the nature of reality itself. On one side stood Cadwallon with his 1,000 warriors, representing the old ways, the ancient gods, the brutal pragmatism of conquest for its own sake. On the other stood Oswald with his 700, representing the new faith, the Prince of Peace, the radical notion that might did not always make right. The GoodKnight had seen such moments before in history, moments when the future hung in the balance, when the choices made by a few hundred souls would echo through the centuries. But never had he seen the stakes laid out so clearly. Never had the contrast been so stark between the forces of light and darkness. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and the sound of approaching hoofbeats began to echo across the moor, the GoodKnight took his position among Oswald's warriors. He would fight this day not just as an observer of history, but as a participant in it. He would stand with these brave men who had chosen faith over fear, hope over despair, and he would help them write a chapter in the great book of human destiny that would inspire generations yet unborn. The vision of St. Columba had promised victory, but the GoodKnight knew that promises from heaven often came with a price. Before this day was done, many good men would die, much blood would be spilled, and the very foundations of the world would be shaken. But from that shaking would come something new and beautiful, a Christian kingdom that would stand as a beacon of faith and learning for centuries to come. The cross stood ready, the army was prepared, and somewhere to the south, Cadwallon was coming with fire and sword to test the strength of their conviction. The Battle of Heavenfield was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Welsh storm approaches. The sound came first as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the moors, and the GoodKnight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded great battles. That moment when the abstract possibility of violence crystallized into the harsh reality of approaching death. From his position near the wooden cross that had become the spiritual heart of Oswald's army, he could see the dust cloud rising on the southern horizon, a brown smudge against the clear blue sky that marked the advance of Cadwallon's host. The morning had grown warm despite the early autumn chill, and the GoodKnight could smell the familiar scents that always preceded battle, the oil on leather armor, the sharp tang of freshly sharpened steel, the nervous sweat of men who knew they might not see another sunset. Around him, Oswald's warriors made their final preparations with the methodical care of professionals who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. But there was something different about this army's preparations, something the GoodKnight had rarely seen in his centuries of warfare. These men worked with a calm confidence that seemed to emanate from the cross itself. as if the wooden symbol had become a conduit for divine strength. They checked their weapons and adjusted their armor with the same careful attention as any other warriors, but their faces showed none of the desperate fear that usually marked outnumbered armies on the eve of battle. The good knight watched as Oswald moved among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement, checking on the positioning of his captains, ensuring that every detail of his battle plan was understood and ready to execute. The young king had been transformed by his vision of St. Columba, but he had not lost his practical understanding of warfare. If anything, his divine confidence seemed to sharpen his tactical thinking, allowing him to see possibilities and opportunities that might have been obscured by doubt or fear. "Remember," Oswald called to his assembled thanes, his voice carrying clearly across the ranks. "We fight not for a conquest, but for justice. We fight not for glory, but for God. And we fight not alone, for the saints of heaven march beside us, and the prayers of the faithful rise like incense before the throne of the Almighty." The good knight had heard many pre-battle speeches in his long existence, had listened to Caesar exhort his legions, had stood with Harold as he rallied the English at Hastings, had witnessed countless commanders attempt to inspire their men with words of courage and duty. But there was something uniquely powerful about Oswald's address, something that went beyond mere rhetoric to touch the very souls of his listeners. As the dust cloud grew larger and the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, scouts began to return with detailed reports of Cadwalladen's army. The Welsh king was coming in force, they reported, perhaps 1,000 men or more, a mixture of Welsh warriors from Gwynedd and Powys, Irish mercenaries, and even some Northumbrian turncoats who had thrown in their lot with the conqueror. They marched under many banners, the red dragon of Gwynedd most prominent among them, and their weapons glinted like stars in the morning sun. But it was not just the size of Cadwalladen's army that impressed the scouts. It was their confidence, their swagger, the easy arrogance of men who had grown accustomed to victory. These were the warriors who had broken Edwin's great host at Hatfield Chase, who had terrorized Northumbria for a full year, who had never known defeat in their campaigns of conquest. They came north not with the desperate determination of men fighting for survival, but with the casual brutality of predators who had found easy prey. The good knight studied the approaching army through eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Cadwalladen's host was indeed impressive, well-armed, well-organized, and led by a king who had proven his tactical brilliance in a dozen battles. The Welsh warriors were renowned for their ferocity in combat, their willingness to fight to the death for their lords and their honor. The Irish mercenaries were professional soldiers who fought for gold and glory, men who had learned their trade in the endless wars of their homeland. And the Northumbrian turncoats, whatever their moral failings, knew the land and the enemy they faced. Against this formidable force, Oswald could field perhaps 700 men, a mixture of Bernician nobles who had followed their prince into exile, Irish warriors from Dalriada who had sworn themselves to his service, and a handful of Northumbrian thanes who had slipped away from Cadwalladen's rule to join their rightful lord. They were brave men, the good knight could see that clearly, but they were also outnumbered and outgunned by an enemy that had never known defeat. Yet, as he watched Oswald's warriors take their positions along the narrow gap between Brady's Crag and Hadrian's Wall, the good knight began to understand the genius of the young king's strategy. This was not merely a desperate last stand, but a carefully calculated gamble that turned Northumbria's weakness into strength, that used the very landscape itself as a weapon against the invaders. The position Oswald had chosen was a masterpiece of defensive warfare. The ancient Roman wall, built 3 centuries earlier to keep the Picts at bay, still stood strong and tall along much of its length. To the north, Brady's Crag rose like a natural fortress, its steep slopes impossible for cavalry to climb and difficult even for infantry to negotiate. Between these two barriers lay a gap perhaps 200 yards wide, narrow enough that Cadwalladen's superior numbers would be compressed into a killing ground, wide enough that Oswald's men could form a proper battle line. The good knight had seen similar tactics employed throughout history. At Thermopylae, Leonidas had used the narrow pass to negate the Persian advantage in numbers. At Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson would one day use a bridge to channel Viking attackers into a deadly bottleneck. The principle was always the same: force a larger enemy to fight on your terms, in a place where their advantages became liabilities. But Oswald's position offered more than just tactical advantages. There was something almost mystical about fighting with one's back to Hadrian's Wall, that great monument to Roman engineering and determination. The good knight could feel the weight of history in the ancient stones, could sense the ghosts of legionaries who had once stood guard on these ramparts against the barbarian hordes. Now their spiritual descendants would make their stand in the same place, defending not just territory, but the very idea of Christian civilization. As the morning wore on and Cadwalladen's army drew closer, the good knight began to make out individual details of the approaching host. The Welsh king himself rode at the front of his army, a tall figure in gleaming mail who carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His banner, the red dragon of Gwynedd, snapped proudly in the breeze, and around him rode his household warriors, the elite troops who had stood with him through all his campaigns of conquest. Behind Cadwallon came the main body of his army, arranged in loose columns that spoke of experienced leadership and disciplined troops. The good knight could see the glint of spear points and sword blades, the colourful shields that bore the devices of a dozen different clans and kingdoms, the proud banners that proclaimed the martial heritage of the Celtic peoples. These were not the wild barbarians of Roman propaganda, but skilled warriors who had learned their trade in the harsh school of constant warfare. The sight of such a host would have struck terror into the hearts of most defenders, but the good knight was amazed to see that Oswald's men showed no signs of fear or doubt. They stood calmly at their posts, checking their weapons one final time, adjusting their shields and spears, preparing to sell their lives as dearly as possible. And at the center of their line, the wooden cross stood like a beacon of hope, its simple form somehow more impressive than all the elaborate banners of the enemy host. When Cadwallon's army finally came within sight of the Northumbrian position, the Welsh king called a halt to study his enemy's dispositions. The good knight watched with professional interest as Cadwallon and his captains surveyed the battlefield, noting the strength of the defensive position, the narrowness of the gap they would have to assault, the determined bearing of the men who awaited them. For a long moment, the two armies faced each other across the moorland, separated by perhaps half a mile of open ground. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the heather and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was one of those moments that the good knight had learned to recognize, a pause in the flow of time when the future hung in the balance, when the choices made in the next few minutes would echo through the centuries. Then Cadwallon spurred his horse forward, riding out from his army with a small escort of his most trusted warriors. The Welsh king was an impressive figure, the good knight had to admit, tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man born to command. His armour was of the finest quality, his weapons bore the marks of master craftsmen, and his horse was a magnificent destrier that spoke of wealth and power. But there was something else about Cadwallon that the good knight found disturbing, something that went beyond mere martial prowess or royal authority. There was a darkness in the man's eyes, a cruelty in the set of his mouth that spoke of someone who had grown to enjoy the suffering of others. This was not a king who fought for the glory of his people or the defense of his realm, but a man who had discovered that he possessed a talent for destruction and had chosen to indulge it without restraint. Oswald rode out to meet his enemy, accompanied by his own small escort of household warriors. The contrast between the two kings could not have been more stark. Where Cadwallon radiated dark charisma and barely contained violence, Oswald projected calm confidence and moral authority. Where the Welsh king's equipment spoke of wealth acquired through conquest and plunder, the Northumbrian's gear was simpler but somehow more noble, marked by the symbols of his Christian faith. The two kings met in the middle of the field, their horses stamping and snorting in the tense silence. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, each taking the measure of his opponent, each seeing in the other everything he despised about the world. "So," Cadwallon said, his voice carrying clearly across the moorland, "the little prince has returned from his exile among the monks. Tell me, boy, did they teach you to fight as well as they taught you to pray?" Oswald's response was calm and measured, showing none of the anger that such an insult might have provoked in a lesser man. "They taught me many things, Cadwallon ap Cadfan. They taught me the difference between justice and tyranny, between a king and a brigand, between a man and a beast." The Welsh king's laughter was harsh and mocking. "Pretty words from a pretty prince, but words will not save you today, nor will your wooden idol." He gestured contemptuously towards the cross that stood at the centre of the Northumbrian line. "I have broken stronger kings than you, boy. I have burned greater kingdoms than this pitiful remnant you claim to rule. Surrender now, and I may allow some of your men to live as slaves." "I serve a king greater than any earthly monarch," Oswald replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I would rather die free in his service than live as a slave to any man. You have terrorized this land for a year, Cadwallon, but your reign of terror ends today. God himself has promised me victory, and in his name I shall drive you from this realm forever." The good knight could see the effect of these words on both armies. Cadwallon's warriors stirred uneasily, disturbed by the absolute confidence in their enemy's voice. Oswald's men, meanwhile, seemed to grow taller and stronger, inspired by their king's unwavering faith. The wooden cross at the centre of their line seemed to glow more brightly, as if responding to the righteousness of their cause. Cadwallon's face darkened with rage at Oswald's defiance. "Then you shall die, boy, and your God with you. Before this day is done, I will use your precious cross for kindling, and your head will join those of your brothers on my spear." With that, the Welsh king wheeled his horse around and galloped back to his army, his escort following close behind. The time for words was over. The time for steel had come. The good knight watched as both armies made their final preparations for battle. Cadwallon's host began to deploy from column into line, a complex maneuver that spoke of experienced leadership and well-trained troops. The Welsh warriors took their positions with the easy confidence of men who had performed this ritual many times before, their shields locked together, their spears bristling like a forest of steel. On the Northumbrian side, Oswald's men made their own preparations with equal skill but greater solemnity. They formed their shield wall with the precision of veterans, but they did so while singing hymns, their voices rising in harmony as they prepared to meet their fate. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a counterpoint to the harsh war cries and weapon clashing of their enemies. The good knight took his place in the Northumbrian line, his silver armour gleaming in the afternoon sun. He had fought in many battles over the centuries, had stood with Romans against barbarians, with Saxons against Vikings, with Christians against pagans. But never had he felt such a sense of righteous purpose, such a conviction that he fought not just for victory, but for the very soul of civilization itself. As the two armies faced each other across the narrow gap between crag and wall, the good knight could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. This was more than just another battle between rival kingdoms. This was a clash between two worldviews, two ways of understanding the nature of power and authority. On one side stood the old ways, the brutal pragmatism of might makes right, the worship of strength for its own sake, the belief that the strong had the right to prey upon the weak. On the other stood something new and revolutionary, The idea that true strength came from service to others, that real power lay in self-sacrifice, that the greatest among men were those who served rather than those who conquered. The outcome of this battle would determine not just the fate of Northumbria, but the future direction of Christian civilization in Britain. If Cadwallon won, the old darkness would continue to spread, and the light of faith would be extinguished for generations to come. If Oswald triumphed, a new age would dawn, an age of learning and piety, of art and scholarship, of kings who ruled by divine right rather than mere force of arms. The good knight gripped his sword more tightly and prepared for the storm that was about to break. Somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded the charge, and with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, Cadwallon's 1,000 warriors began their advance toward the narrow gap where 700 Northumbrians waited with their wooden cross and their unshakable faith. The Battle of Heavenfield was about to begin, and with it would come the birth of a legend that would echo through the ages. Chapter 4. The Clash of Steel and Faith. The earth trembled beneath 1,000 feet as Cadwallon's host surged forward like a tide of iron and fury, and the good knight felt the familiar surge of battle madness that had carried him through countless conflicts across the centuries. But this time it was tempered by something he had rarely experienced before: the absolute certainty that he fought on the side of righteousness itself. The Welsh war cry rose like thunder across the moorland, a sound that had struck terror into the hearts of their enemies, from Ireland to the borders of Wessex, but the Northumbrian line held steady as stone, their shields locked together, their spears levelled, their voices raised in hymns that seemed to transform the very air around them. The good knight stood in the second rank of the shield wall, his silver armour gleaming like starlight among the more modest gear of his companions. To his left stood a grizzled thane named Godric, a veteran of Edwin's wars whose scarred face spoke of a dozen battles survived. To his right was a young warrior barely old enough to grow a beard, his hands trembling slightly on his spear shaft, but his eyes bright with the fervour of absolute faith. Behind them all, the wooden cross rose like a beacon, its simple form somehow more magnificent than all the golden eagles of Rome or the jewelled banners of Byzantine emperors. As Cadwallon's army approached the narrow gap between Brady's Crag and Hadrian's Wall, the good knight could see the tactical genius of Oswald's position beginning to take effect. The Welsh host, which had advanced in a broad front across the open moorland, was now being compressed into an ever-narrowing funnel. Warriors who had been fighting shoulder to shoulder with their comrades suddenly found themselves pressed together in an uncomfortable mass, their weapons interfering with one another, their carefully maintained formations beginning to buckle under the pressure. But these were experienced warriors, men who had learned their trade in the harsh school of Celtic warfare, and they adapted quickly to the changing conditions. The front ranks lowered their spears and locked their shields, forming their own version of the wall that awaited them. Behind them, the second and third ranks prepared to push forward, adding their weight to the charge that would either break the Northumbrian line or die in the attempt. The good knight had seen such moments countless times before, that final instant before impact when time seemed to slow to a crawl, when every detail became crystal clear, when the world narrowed to the space between shield rim and spear point. He could see the individual faces of the approaching Welsh warriors, could read the mixture of confidence and fear in their eyes, could smell the leather and iron and sweat that marked all armies on the march. But there was something different about this moment, something that set it apart from all the other battles he had witnessed. The air itself seemed charged with supernatural energy, as if the very angels of heaven were holding their breath to see the outcome. The wooden cross behind him seemed to pulse with inner light, and he could swear he heard the whisper of wings overhead, though when he glanced up, he saw only empty sky. Then the two shield walls met with a crash that seemed to shake the foundations of the world. The impact was tremendous, a collision of wood and iron and human flesh that sent shockwaves through both armies. The good knight felt the man in front of him driven back by the force of the Welsh charge, felt the entire Northumbrian line bend like a bow under the pressure. For a moment, it seemed as if Oswald's thin ranks might shatter entirely, might be swept away by the sheer momentum of Cadwalladen's assault. But the line held. It held because these men had more than just courage and skill. They had faith. They had knelt before the cross that morning and placed their lives in the hands of the Almighty. They had heard their king's vision of St. Columba and believed that heaven itself had promised them victory. And that belief, that absolute certainty in the righteousness of their cause, gave them strength beyond anything mere flesh and blood could provide. The good knight found himself pressed forward into the front rank as the warrior ahead of him fell with a Welsh spear through his throat. Suddenly he was face to face with a massive Celtic warrior whose shield bore the device of a snarling wolf, whose eyes burned with the fury of a man who had never known defeat. The Welshman's spear thrust forward like a striking serpent, aimed at the gap between the good knight's helmet and his mail shirt. But the good knight had been fighting battles when this warrior's grandfather was still learning to walk. His sword swept up in a perfect arc, deflecting the spear point and sliding along the shaft to bite deep into the Welshman's wrist. Blood sprayed across both of their shields as the warrior dropped his weapon with a scream of pain and rage. The good knight's return stroke took the man in the throat, dropping him to the blood-soaked earth. But there was no time to savor the victory, for another warrior was already stepping forward to take his fallen comrade's place, and behind him came another, and another. An endless tide of enemies pressing forward with the desperate fury of men who had staked everything on this single throw of the dice. All along the line, the battle raged with an intensity that defied description. The narrow gap between crag and wall had become a charnel house, a place where men died by the dozen and their blood soaked into the ancient soil of Northumbria. The clash of weapons was deafening, a constant din of iron on iron that drowned out even the screams of the wounded and dying. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. The Welsh charge, so fierce and confident at the beginning, began to lose momentum as it ground against the immovable wall of Northumbrian shields. The compressed formation that had seemed like such an advantage began to work against Cadwalladen's warriors, as men in the rear ranks found themselves unable to bring their weapons to bear, unable to support their comrades in the front line. The good knight could feel the change in the rhythm of battle, could sense the moment when confidence began to give way to doubt, when the certainty of victory started to crumble into the fear of defeat. He had experienced this transformation many times before, had learned to recognize the subtle signs that marked the turning point of any engagement. It began with small things, a Welsh warrior glancing nervously over his shoulder, a spear thrust that lacked conviction, a shield held a little too defensively. But these small cracks in morale spread quickly through the compressed ranks, magnified by the claustrophobic conditions and the growing realization that the easy victory they had expected was turning into a grinding nightmare of attrition. The good knight pressed forward, his sword weaving patterns of death among the enemy ranks. To his left, old Godric fought with the methodical efficiency of a veteran, his spear finding gaps in Welsh armor with unerring precision. To his right, the young warrior had overcome his initial nervousness and was fighting with the fury of a man possessed, his blade singing as it carved through enemy shields and mail. But it was not just individual prowess that was winning the day for the Northumbrians. It was something deeper, something that went beyond mere martial skill or tactical advantage. The good knight could feel it flowing through the ranks like an electric current, the power of absolute faith, the strength that came from knowing beyond any doubt that God himself fought beside them. Behind the fighting line, he could hear Oswald's voice raised in prayer, calling upon the saints and angels to aid his warriors in their hour of need. The king had not taken a position in the shield wall. His captains had insisted that he remain in reserve, ready to plug any gap that might appear in their thin line. But his presence was felt by every man who fought. His faith was their faith, his certainty their certainty, his vision of divine victory the source of their superhuman endurance. The wooden cross stood at the center of it all, its simple form somehow more inspiring than all the golden idols of the pagan world. Men fought harder when they could see it, died more bravely when its shadow fell across them, found strength they never knew they possessed when they remembered the prayers they had offered before it that morning. As the battle raged on, the GoodKnight began to notice something remarkable happening in the Welsh ranks. The warriors in the front line, pressed against the Northumbrian shields, were beginning to show signs of exhaustion and demoralization. But more importantly, those in the rear were starting to lose their enthusiasm for the fight. Compressed into the narrow gap, unable to see what was happening at the front, hearing only the screams of their comrades and the clash of weapons, they began to wonder if perhaps this battle was not going as well as their leaders had promised. The first sign of real trouble came when a group of Welsh warriors near the back of the formation began to edge sideways, seeking a way out of the deadly funnel they had entered so confidently. The movement was subtle at first, barely noticeable among the general chaos of battle, but the GoodKnight's experienced eye caught it immediately. He had seen this before, had witnessed the moment when an army's confidence began to crack. It always started the same way, with men at the edges of the formation, men who had the option of retreat, beginning to question whether the cause was worth their lives. Once that doubt took hold, it spread like wildfire through the ranks, transforming a disciplined army into a panicked mob in a matter of minutes. The GoodKnight redoubled his efforts, his sword cutting through Welsh shields like a scythe through wheat. Around him, the other Northumbrian warriors seemed to sense that the moment of decision was at hand. Their attacks became more ferocious, their war cries more confident, their movements more coordinated. They could smell victory in the air, could feel the enemy's resolve beginning to crumble. Then, somewhere in the middle of the Welsh formation, a voice cried out in panic, "We're trapped! They've trapped us between the rocks!" The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The realization that they were fighting in a confined space, that their superior numbers meant nothing in the narrow gap, that they were being slaughtered like sheep in a pen, spread through the Welsh ranks like wildfire. Men who had been pressing forward moments before suddenly began to push backward, seeking escape from the killing ground they had entered so confidently. But there was nowhere to go. The warriors behind them were still pushing forward, still trying to bring their weight to bear against the Northumbrian line. The result was chaos. Men fighting their own comrades for space, weapons tangling together, the careful formations that had marked Cadwalladen's advance dissolving into a writhing mass of confusion and fear. The GoodKnight saw his opportunity and seized it. With a war cry that seemed to echo from the very stones of Hadrian's wall, he burst through the Welsh front line, his silver armor blazing like a star in the afternoon sun. Behind him came Godric and the young warrior and a dozen other Northumbrians, their shields locked together, their spears leveled, driving deep into the heart of the enemy formation. The psychological effect was devastating. To see their enemies not just holding their ground but actually advancing, actually pushing forward into their ranks, was more than the demoralized Welsh warriors could bear. The retreat that had begun as a trickle became a flood, then a torrent, then a complete rout. "Cadwallon!" someone screamed. "Where is the king? Where is Cadwallon?" The GoodKnight looked around the battlefield, searching for the Welsh leader whose presence had held this army together. He spotted him near the rear of the formation, still mounted on his great destrier, still trying to rally his men with voice and sword. But even Cadwallon's legendary charisma could not stem the tide of panic that was sweeping through his ranks. The Welsh king's face was a mask of rage and disbelief as he watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. This was not how it was supposed to happen. His army was larger, more experienced, better equipped. They had never known defeat, had conquered every enemy they had faced. How could a handful of Christian fanatics with their wooden idol possibly stand against the might of Gwynedd? But stand they had, and more than that, they had won. The good knight could see it in Cadwalladen's eyes, could read the moment when the Welsh king realized that his reign of terror was coming to an end. For a heartbeat, their gazes met across the battlefield, and in that instant, the good knight saw something he had rarely witnessed in all his centuries of warfare, the look of a man who had finally met his match and found himself wanting. Then Cadwallon was wheeling his horse around, shouting orders to his household warriors, trying to organize some kind of fighting retreat from the disaster that had befallen his army. But it was too late. The panic had spread too far. The rout had become too complete. What had been an army was now a mob, and mobs did not fight. They fled. The pursuit began immediately. Oswald's voice rang out across the battlefield, calling his men to follow up their victory, to ensure that Cadwallon's forces were so thoroughly broken that they could never threaten Northumbria again. The wooden cross was lifted from its place and carried forward like a battle standard, its presence inspiring the Northumbrian warriors to feats of endurance and courage that seemed almost superhuman. The good knight found himself swept along in the tide of pursuit, his silver armor flashing in the afternoon sun as he ran alongside men half his apparent age. The Welsh retreat had become a headlong flight southward, with Cadwallon's warriors throwing away their weapons and armor in their desperate haste to escape the wrath of the Christian army. For miles the chase continued, across moorland and through valleys, past ancient stone circles and abandoned Roman settlements. The good knight had participated in many pursuits over the centuries, but never one quite like this. There was something almost mystical about it, as if the very landscape itself was conspiring to aid the Northumbrian cause. Streams seemed to run lower to allow easier crossing, hills seemed less steep to climb, the very air seemed to carry the sound of their war cries farther than should have been possible. As they ran, the good knight found himself thinking about the battle they had just won. It had been more than just a military victory. It had been a vindication of faith over force, of righteousness over brutality, of the new Christian order over the old pagan chaos. The wooden cross that bobbed ahead of him in the hands of a young warrior seemed to glow with inner light, as if it had become a conduit for divine power. But the pursuit was not over yet. Somewhere ahead of them, Cadwallon was still alive, still dangerous, still capable of rallying his scattered forces if given the chance. The Welsh king had to be found, had to be defeated once and for all, or this victory would be incomplete. The good knight pressed forward, his ancient legs carrying him over the rough ground with the tireless endurance that was one of his supernatural gifts. The sun was beginning to sink towards the western horizon when they finally caught up with their quarry. At a place called Denise's Burner, the Rowley Burn, where a small stream wound its way through a valley lined with ancient oaks, Cadwallon had finally been brought to bay. His great destrier had gone lame, his household warriors had been scattered or killed, and he found himself alone and on foot, facing the wrath of the army he had so confidently expected to destroy. The good knight was among the first to reach the stream, and he watched with grim satisfaction as the Welsh king made his final stand. Cadwallon was still a formidable warrior, his sword weaving patterns of death among the Northumbrians who pressed around him. But he was one man against many, and his strength was failing after the long flight from Heavenfield. The end came quickly. A Northumbrian spear found the gap between Cadwallon's helmet and his mail shirt, and the Welsh king fell to his knees in the shallow water of the burn. His sword slipped from nerveless fingers, and his proud head bowed as the life flowed out of him in a crimson stream. The good knight felt no joy at the sight, only a profound sense of completion. Justice had been done. The tyrant who had terrorized Northumbria for a year, who had murdered 3 kings and countless innocent people, who had sought to extinguish the light of Christianity in the north, had finally met his fate. The reign of terror was over. As the sun set over the battlefield at Heavenfield and the stream at Denises Burna, the good knight stood among the victorious Northumbrians and marvelled at what he had witnessed. 700 men had faced 1,000 and emerged triumphant. A young king with nothing but faith and courage had reclaimed his kingdom from a tyrant who had seemed invincible. A wooden cross had proven mightier than all the weapons of war. But more than that, something fundamental had changed in the world. The old order, based on nothing but strength and brutality, had been challenged and found wanting. In its place was rising something new, a Christian kingdom where kings ruled by divine right rather than mere force, where the weak were protected rather than preyed upon, where learning and piety were valued as highly as martial prowess. The Battle of Heavenfield was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The good knight had witnessed the birth of a legend, the moment when Oswald of Northumbria stepped from the shadows of exile into the full light of history. The wooden cross that had stood at the center of the battlefield would become a shrine, a place of pilgrimage where miracles were said to occur. And the young king who had knelt before it in prayer would become a saint, his brief but brilliant reign remembered as a golden age of faith and justice. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the good knight made his way back toward the battlefield where it had all begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new tests of faith and courage. But tonight he was content to walk among the victorious warriors and remember the moment when heaven and earth had touched, when the impossible had become inevitable, when 700 men with unshakable faith had changed the course of history itself. The Battle of Heavenfield was won, and with it, the future of Christian England was secured. Chapter 5. The Crown of Victory. The dawn that broke over Heavenfield 3 days after the battle was unlike any the good knight had witnessed in his long existence, not because of any supernatural phenomenon, but because it illuminated a world fundamentally transformed by the events that had unfolded on this sacred ground. The wooden cross still stood where Oswald had planted it, but now it was surrounded by a growing collection of offerings, weapons laid down by former enemies who had witnessed the miracle of the Christian victory, flowers brought by local villagers who had emerged from hiding, and crude wooden carvings left by pilgrims who had already begun to arrive from across Northumbria. The good knight stood in the morning mist, his silver armour dulled by 3 days of continuous wear, watching as King Oswald moved among the wounded with the gentle care of a shepherd tending his flock. The young king had been transformed by his victory, but not in the way the good knight had seen other conquerors changed by success. There was no arrogance in Oswald's bearing, no swagger of triumph, no cruel satisfaction at his enemy's defeat. Instead, there was a profound humility, a deep awareness that he had been chosen as an instrument of a divine will rather than the architect of his own glory. "My lord," said Godric, the grizzled thane who had fought beside the good knight in the shield wall, approaching with a mixture of reverence and familiarity that spoke of the bonds forged in battle. "The messengers have returned from Bamborough. The fortress has declared for you, and the garrison awaits your commands. All of Bernicia acknowledges you as king." Oswald nodded gravely, but his attention remained focused on a young warrior whose leg had been shattered by a Welsh spear. The king's hands, which had wielded sword and shield with such deadly efficiency just days before, now moved with infinite gentleness as he helped the monastery's healers tend to the wounded man's injuries. "And what of Daera?" Oswald asked, without looking up from his patient. "Have the southern thanes sent word of their intentions?" "They have, my lord," Godric replied, and the good knight could hear the satisfaction in the old warrior's voice. "The news of Cadwalladen's death has spread like wildfire. The Daeran nobles who survived his purges are gathering at York, and they beg you to accept the crown of the southern kingdom as well. They say they have had enough of tyrants and turncoats. They want a king who rules by God's grace rather than the sword's edge." The good knight watched Oswald's reaction to this news with fascination. Here was the moment that every ambitious prince dreamed of. The offer of not just one kingdom but two, the chance to unite Northumbria under a single crown for the first time in a generation. Lesser men would have leaped at such an opportunity, would have seen it as validation of their own greatness, proof of their destiny to rule. But Oswald's response was characteristically thoughtful. "The crown is not mine to take," he said quietly, finally looking up from the wounded warrior. "It belongs to God, and I am merely his steward. If the people of Deira truly wish me to rule them, then I will accept that burden, but only if I can be certain that I will serve their needs rather than my own ambitions." It was a remarkable statement, one that revealed the depth of the transformation that had taken place in the young king's heart during his years of exile among the monks of Iona. The good knight had known many rulers in his long existence, had served emperors and kings, had watched the rise and fall of dynasties across the centuries. But he had rarely encountered a man who understood so clearly that true kingship was not about power, but about service, not about conquest, but about protection, not about glory, but about sacrifice. As the morning progressed, more messengers arrived from across Northumbria and beyond. The news of Oswald's miraculous victory was spreading throughout Britain, carried by traders and travellers, monks and merchants, bards and storytellers who understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The wooden cross at Heavenfield was already being spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, and tales of miracles associated with it were beginning to circulate among the common people. The good knight listened to these reports with the detached interest of one who had seen how legends were born. He understood that the truth of what had happened at Heavenfield, the careful tactical planning, the exploitation of terrain, the superior morale and discipline of Oswald's forces, would gradually be overshadowed by the more dramatic elements of the story. Future generations would remember the vision of Saint Columba, the raising of the cross, the miraculous victory against impossible odds. They would forget the mundane details of shield walls and spear thrusts, of exhaustion and fear, and the simple human courage that had carried the day. But perhaps that was as it should be. The good knight had learned over the centuries that people needed their legends, needed stories that spoke to something deeper than mere historical fact. The Battle of Heavenfield had indeed been a miracle, not because of supernatural intervention, but because it had shown that faith and righteousness could triumph over brutality and oppression, that a small group of dedicated men could change the course of history through their willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves. On the fourth day after the battle, a delegation arrived from the monastery of Iona that would prove to be of immense significance for the future of Northumbria. Led by a monk named Aidan, a man whose gentle demeanor concealed a will of iron and a mind of extraordinary brilliance, the delegation had come to congratulate Oswald on his victory and to discuss the future of Christianity in the reunited kingdom. The good knight observed the meeting between Oswald and Aidan with the keen interest of one who recognized a pivotal moment in history. The two men were perfectly matched, the warrior king who had proven his faith on the battlefield, and the scholar monk who had dedicated his life to spreading the gospel throughout the Celtic lands. When they spoke together, it was with the easy familiarity of old friends, for Aidan had been one of Oswald's teachers during his years of exile on Iona. "The victory God has granted you is only the beginning, my son," Aidan said as they walked together through the camp, past the wounded warriors and the piles of captured weapons. "You have won back your earthly kingdom, but now you must help us win souls for the kingdom of heaven." Oswald's response revealed the depth of his commitment to his faith. "Tell me what you need, Father, and it shall be yours. Gold, land, protection. whatever will serve the cause of Christ in this realm." The good knight watched as Aidan's eyes lit up with the fervor of a true missionary. "Not gold, my lord, though we will need some resources. What we need most is your support in establishing a center of learning and evangelization, a place where we can train priests and monks to carry the gospel to every corner of your kingdom. I have in mind an island off your coast, Lindisfarne, the Holy Island. It would be perfect for our purposes." And so, in a conversation that lasted barely an hour, the foundations were laid for what would become one of the greatest centers of Christian learning in medieval Europe. The good knight understood that he was witnessing the birth of something extraordinary, a partnership between temporal and spiritual power that would transform not just Northumbria, but all of northern England. As the days passed and Oswald's court began to take shape, the good knight found himself increasingly impressed by the young king's approach to governance. Unlike the brutal autocrats he had known throughout history, Oswald ruled through consensus and consultation, seeking the advice of his thanes and bishops before making important decisions. He established laws that protected the weak from the strong, that ensured justice for all regardless of their station in life, that reflected the Christian principles he had learned during his exile. But it was not just Oswald's domestic policies that impressed the good knight. The king's approach to foreign relations was equally remarkable, marked by a combination of strength and diplomacy that gradually extended Northumbrian influence throughout Britain. Rather than simply conquering his neighbours, Oswald sought to convert them, to bring them into the Christian fold through example and persuasion rather than force of arms. The good knight was present when messengers arrived from Wessex, bearing an offer of alliance from King Cynegiles. The West Saxon king had recently converted to Christianity and sought to strengthen his position through marriage ties with the powerful Northumbrian dynasty. The negotiations that followed were complex and delicate, involving not just political considerations but religious ones as well. "I will accept your daughter as my bride," Oswald told the Wessex ambassadors, "but only if she comes to me as a Christian queen, ready to help spread the faith throughout our united realms. This marriage must be more than just a political alliance. It must be a sacred bond that serves God's purposes as well as our own." The wedding that followed was unlike any the good knight had witnessed in his long existence. Held at the newly established monastery on Lindisfarne, it was both a royal ceremony and a religious celebration, a public declaration that the age of pagan kingship was ending and a new era of Christian monarchy was beginning. Oswald and his bride knelt together before the altar, receiving not just the blessings of their earthly subjects, but the benediction of heaven itself. As the months passed and Oswald's reign took on the characteristics that would define it for posterity, the good knight began to understand why St. Columba had appeared to the young king on the eve of battle. This was indeed a man chosen by God for a special purpose, a ruler who would serve as a bridge between the old world and the new, between the age of tribal warfare and the era of Christian civilization. The wooden cross at Heavenfield had become a place of pilgrimage, drawing visitors from across Britain and beyond. The good knight often returned there, drawn by memories of that miraculous day when 700 men had changed the course of history. He would stand in the shadow of the cross and remember the faces of the men who had fought beside him, many of whom now lay buried in the small cemetery that had grown up around the sacred site. But it was not just the dead who were remembered at Heavenfield. The living came too, former enemies who had witnessed the power of Christian forgiveness, young men seeking to understand the source of Oswald's strength, pilgrims hoping for healing or guidance, or simply the peace that seemed to emanate from the holy ground. The good knight watched them all with the patient interest of one who had seen how legends grew and evolved over time. One day, as he stood beside the cross in the gathering dusk, the good knight was approached by a young monk from Lindisfarne who had come to tend the shrine. The man was clearly nervous about addressing the mysterious warrior in silver armor who was often seen at the site, but never spoke to anyone. "My lord," the monk said hesitantly, "forgive my boldness, but I have heard it said that you were present at the great battle, that you fought beside King Oswald when he won his miraculous victory. Is this true?" The good knight considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I was here," he said simply. "I saw what happened." "Then you witnessed a miracle," the monk said, his voice filled with awe. "You saw the hand of God at work in the affairs of men. How blessed you are to have been chosen for such a privilege." The good knight smiled, though the expression was hidden by his helmet. "We are all chosen for something, brother. The question is whether we have the courage to accept our calling when it comes." As the years passed and Oswald's reign reached its zenith, the good knight began to sense that the golden age was approaching its end. The king had achieved everything that St. Columba had promised. He had united Northumbria, spread Christianity throughout his realm, established centers of learning and piety that would endure for centuries. But the saint had also warned of the price that would be paid for such glory, and the good knight could feel the shadow of that prophecy beginning to fall across the land. The threat came, as it so often did, from Mercia. Penda, that fierce pagan king who had once allied with Cadwallon, had spent the years since Heavenfield building his own power, forging alliances with other pagan rulers, preparing for the day when he would challenge the Christian kingdom that had grown so strong in the north. The good knight had fought against Penda before, had seen the brutal efficiency with which the Mercian king waged war, and he knew that this would be a very different kind of conflict from the miraculous victory at Heavenfield. When the news came that Penda was marching north with a great army, Oswald received it with the same calm acceptance he had shown throughout his reign. The good knight was present in the great hall at Bamborough when the king addressed his assembled thanes, and he was struck by the change that had come over the man who had once knelt before a wooden cross and received a vision of victory. "My friends," Oswald said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "we have been blessed with 8 years of peace and prosperity. 8 years in which we have built something beautiful and lasting in this realm. Now that peace is threatened, and we must once again take up our swords in defense of all we hold dear." The king paused, and the good knight could see in his eyes the knowledge of what was to come. St. Columba had promised victory at Heavenfield, but he had also warned that Oswald's reign would be brief. The time of reckoning was at hand. "I do not know what fate awaits us in the coming battle," Oswald continued, "but I know this. We have served God faithfully, we have ruled justly, we have protected the weak, and spread the light of Christ throughout this land. Whatever happens, we can face it with clean consciences and pure hearts." The good knight felt a familiar tightening in his chest as he listened to these words. He had heard similar speeches before, had stood with other doomed kings as they prepared to meet their destiny. But there was something different about Oswald's acceptance of his fate, something that spoke of a man who had found peace with the role he had been chosen to play in the great drama of history. The Battle of Maserfield, when it came, was everything that Heavenfield had not been. Where the earlier conflict had been a miraculous victory against impossible odds, this was a grinding defeat that saw the flower of Northumbrian nobility cut down in their prime. The good knight fought beside his king until the very end, watching as Oswald fell beneath the swords of Penda's warriors, seeing the light fade from the eyes of the man who had been chosen by God for greatness. But even in defeat, even in death, Oswald's victory was complete. The kingdom he had built survived his passing. The faith he had spread continued to flourish. The legend he had created at Heavenfield inspired future generations to seek the same combination of courage and righteousness that had marked his brief but brilliant reign. As the good knight stood over his fallen king in the aftermath of Maserfield, he thought back to that morning at Heavenfield when a young prince had knelt before a wooden cross and placed his trust in divine providence. The vision of St. Columba had been fulfilled in every detail. Oswald had won his miraculous victory, had ruled as a Christian king, had spread the faith throughout his realm, and had died a martyr's death that would ensure his eternal glory. The wooden cross still stood at Heavenfield, and it would continue to stand for centuries to come, a monument to the day when faith had triumphed over force, when righteousness had overcome brutality, when 700 men with unshakable conviction had changed the course of history itself. The good knight had witnessed many battles in his long existence, but none had moved him as deeply as that miraculous day when heaven and earth had touched, when the impossible had become inevitable, when the future of Christian England had been secured by the courage of a young king and the power of a simple wooden cross. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.